Orville Palmer Wilson was born in 1928 while the family was living at Sayre. When he turned 16, Orville began work at the local tin mill. There he met his wife, Mary Alice Smith. They fell in love and got married. Theirs was the first wedding held in the house on McAdory. To make the event even more festive, Orville's younger sister Bobby was also married. A double wedding, a double celebration. Orville and Mary Alice had 2 children. Mary Elizabeth, born November the 11th, 1947, and Stephen Hollis, born March the 16th, 1958, who died shortly after birth. Mary Elizabeth married James A. Casio, April the 9th, 1967. Liz and Jim have 2 sons, John, born November the 11th, 1972, and Mark, born October the 17th, 1983. After 12 years and 4 brothers, Mary Alice had to be excited to have another girl in the house, Bobby Nell Wilson.
I was the 6th child to Annie and Emery Wilson. Mother named me Bobby Nell after a teacher that she had known and respected. Mother was 29 years old and my sister Mary was 13. I'm told that Mary was more like the little mother to me than my mother was. In fact, she made a cradle for me out of an old trunk lid that she had. And she used to rock me to sleep in that. Mary tells me that James decided he'd rock me to sleep, and he wasn't very old either. But he rocked me too hard and rocked me right out of the trunk lid. In those days, we'd use the same water that Mother washed the clothes in to bathe in, and that was usually about once a week. Otherwise, we'd just wash up every morning. Daddy and the boys, though, built us a new house, and that was next door to the old house. After working all day in the mines, Daddy'd come home at night and they'd light the old kerosene lamp, and he and the boys would go out and they'd hammer and they'd fix the new house. In fact, when we left Margaret and sold that house, he sold it for $750. But in later years, we bought this old battery radio. So on Saturday night, we'd sit around and we'd listen to this Grand Ole Opry and the Squeaking Door and all of the things that came on. On Sunday night, I'd be listening to the Squeaking Door and everybody else would go to church. I'd have to run and catch up with them because we had to go to church on Sunday. I went to Bessemer High School and graduated in the class of 1950. I wasn't a real good student, but I never had to study. I was just probably average. My average grades got me in the Tri-Hawaii and the Y teams, even though I always wanted to be in the sports club and be a cheerleader. I met Jimmy LaGrone in 1951. Jimmy had gone to McAdory High School. That's the reason we had never known each other. And with him, the funny thing was, I just saw him standing in front of a movie theater one night and called the lady that took the tickets and said, "Who was that guy standing there about 10 o'clock last night?" You know, and that's the way we got together. At that time, Mary Alice was going with my brother Orville. And one weekend, Jimmy was in Jacksonville, and we were going to Panama City. And he said, "Why don't everybody meet me in Panama City?" So we met them in Panama City. And Jimmy and Mary Alice and Orville and I got to be pretty close. And Orville and Mary Alice had planned to get married, and Jimmy had been asking me to marry him, and I didn't feel like that I had really known him long enough. And finally, being the frugal person that I am, I said, well, why don't we just get married when Eros and Orville get married? We'll just have a double wedding. We got married in Mother's home, and the funny thing was, that was a funny wedding, because Daddy had never stood up at a wedding or anything, so we tried to rehearse for it. My brother Kenny stood in the back bedroom with a shotgun as we walked past, so we were all tickled by the time we even got to where we were supposed to be. And Daddy practiced and did everything fine. Well, the next night when we got married, the preacher stood there and he says, who gives this girl in marriage? And Daddy just stood there with this blank stare on his face, and I kept nudging him in the sides, you know, and finally he said, I do, real hesitant. And later, Joyce got married not too long after that, and they said that the preacher says, who gives this girl? And Daddy says, I do, because he had already rehearsed with me, you know. And they teased him later on and said, well, you didn't want to give Bobby away, but you couldn't wait to give Joyce away. And that was the way we got married. At that time, I followed him to California, and over the years, followed him to different places, which is the way I got into Chicago. We were divorced in 1964. I started at IH in 1957 after my second venture to Chicago. Tony Sinlower also worked for International Harvester. He was a foreman on the night shift, and my girlfriend, who was the employment supervisor, was the first one that called him to my attention. So after being divorced 6 years and our plant was closing down, I had encouraged Tony and his friend to come to a party that we were having for my boss, who I was really fond of. And Tony came. That night we sat up all night long. After the party, he lived out my way, so he said, do you want to stop for coffee? And I said, yes, if you want to. And we stopped at a coffee shop near my house, and we stayed up all night talking. I had to go to work the next day. It happened to be Saturday. In those days, girls couldn't work over 8 hours. So I worked every Saturday that I could, and I'd get a part-time job to help me with my finances. In 1970, when Tony and I got married in 1970, June the 22nd, Harvester was in a big transition, and none of us knew whether we would have a job or not, so we really never knew whether we'd end up with Harvester or what. I forgot to say that we were married on the island of Bermuda, which we invited everybody to come, and nobody came. But we had fun. We had about 7 days of just a really great time. The kids that we had worked with had taken up a collection and given us $110 and told us to spend it any way we wanted to. So the first days were spent at the Princess Hotel, which was the biggest and the best, and the maid service and all this, which was my lifestyle. Tony's lifestyle was the little cottage on the other end of the island, cook your own meals, catch your own fish if you could, and that was his day. As a wedding gift, our plant manager and our employment supervisor, who was my girlfriend, gave us our first beagle. That's the way we got started with our beagle family. Her name was Prissy, so Prissy and Pierre were our roommates until 1976. At that time, Prissy had died and Pierre had died. We immediately bought 2 more beagle dogs, who mated and had 7 beagles. This made our ranch home too small, so we moved 17 blocks away to a house twice as big to help accommodate the new family. We lived there until we retired in 1987. At that time, we had bought land in Ozark, Alabama, and hoped to retire there and build there. But after a few trips to Alabama, we found that we just couldn't afford the price of building a new home and new roads and putting in the electricity and all this. Started looking for alternatives, and one day Tony says, remember that little place with a lake, that little town, Lake Eufaula or something like that? Finally, we got down to Eufaula in September 1987. Found the house of our dreams at 65 Woodlawn Estates, and went back to Illinois, put our house up for sale, and came back to Eufaula in November, bought the house in Eufaula, and moved permanently in January 1988.